Well, Robin Hood, of course, is famous for being the good outlaw, the prince of thieves, and for taking from the rich, giving to the poor. But the cynics would say this just isn't mentioned in any of the sources until the somewhat dubious chronicler John Mayer, or John Major, in 1523. And in sort of absolute terms, well, that's true. But early sources do suggest that what John Mayer is talking about is representative of the old tradition, because he himself is drawing on ancient ballads, and he makes quite clear that that's his source for this. And when you look at early chroniclers, well, the first chronicle mention calls him a good outlaw, and the second one, Walter Bauer, writing in the 1440s, says that that much good is told of him in the ballads that tell his story. And when you look at the Jest of Robin Hood, then you can see that Robin is portrayed as an outlaw who is very concerned about right and wrong. And you could see that as the whole point of the jest in many ways. This is not a wild outlaw. In fact, the word wild is only ever used twice of Robin Hood and his outlaws in medieval sources. And in both cases, one is in the Jest, one is in Robin Hood and the Monk. In both cases, it's used in a context which shows that actually it's inappropriate. It is the sort of thing that people say about outlaws, but it's not really true. And there's one ballad which is first recorded in the 1600s, called Robin Hood and the Old Woman, Robin Hood and the Old Wife. And it gets printed as a broadside under the title of Robin Hood and the Bishop. That takes a little bit of subtle alteration to the story, where the role of the Sheriff of Nottingham is replaced by the role of a bishop, an unnamed bishop, but it gives the opportunity to take verses out of another ballad called Robin Hood and the Bishop of Hereford. And in that ballad, anyway, let's leave that aside, the old woman is just, if you like, a random old woman. Robin Hood is running from the sheriff, and he sees a little cottage. He goes into the cottage, and inside the little cottage there's an old woman. And he says, "Will you help me?" And she says, "Well, who are you that I should help you?" And he says, "I'm the outlaw Robin Hood." And suddenly she says, "Ah, well, if you're Robin Hood, then I remember the time that you gave me money to buy stockings and shoes to keep my feet from the cold. And so, yes, I'll help you." And she then takes control of the situation. She swaps clothes with Robin. She gets Robin to give her his bow, and he runs off, and she meets the Sheriff of Nottingham and threatens him with the bow, and then agrees to come quietly. And off they ride through the woods. And after a while, the sheriff sees some men dressed in Lincoln green, and he calls out to he calls out to the old woman, "Who are these?" And she says, "Well, I think that's Robin Hood." And the sheriff says, "Well, if that's Robin Hood, then who are you?" And she says, "Well, I'm just an old woman." And so away rides the sheriff to get away from this 100 outlaws that are suddenly ranged against him. And the old woman has freed Robin Hood, and she also has got the sheriff's horse into the bargain, for which Robin, of course, rewards her. This is, it's not a huge amount of evidence to go on. But we're not dealing with huge amounts of evidence for any of this. So what we have is the three earliest chroniclers who all either say that Robin Hood was good or that he stole from the rich to give to the poor. And then we've got this one ballad which is recorded in the 1600s and appears very possibly to have earlier sources, but it's always very difficult to tell. What we can say is that in the earliest traditions, Robin Hood is clearly seen as not just any old outlaw. That's the point of the Robin Hood story. That's why every outlaw today we want to make into a Robin Hood figure. It's not that there's an inevitable thing that any outlaw is seen as good. We want to see outlaws as good because we hope that they might be Robin Hood. Unfortunately, most of them aren't. But it doesn't mean that we can't say the same about Robin Hood.